This is not a recruitment podcast. Welcome back to another episode of Powered by People, the Not Recruitment podcast, where we talk a lot about recruitment. We are joined by the lovely Rose Hargreaves from Klarna. I would also like to welcome my co-host today, Ben Leeson, our Brand Experience Director here at the Rec Hub. And today's topic or topics, we're going to be discussing a lot about women in talent and women in recruitment. Rose has come from an agency background. Why don't you give yourself a little intro, Rose?
Yes. So my agency background would probably be primarily Michael Page, where I worked at the senior consultant level. I moved to Klarna. I've been here just under 2 years now, working on their global talent acquisition team. And I also recently had a baby.
Woo!
My beautiful daughter Mia is just over 1 year old now, so just kind of learning being a mum and working at the same time.
And that's what we're going to incorporate a lot of today's podcast around returning to work after mat leave, which Rose has got some amazing stats on, scary stats, but great things that we can look at to improve the industry as a whole. Female leaders and female managers, and you know, particularly how some of those positive traits can be influenced, and networking with colleagues. I think a lot of the recruitment industry tends to be probably not favourable to parents, particularly, although it did allow me to meet my wife, so we'll come to that later. Cool. So why don't we kick off with your experience, Rose, landing, having a baby and then coming back to work. How's that been?
Yeah, it was an interesting one for a couple of reasons. Firstly, my husband also works at Klarna, so that was quite interesting navigating that around parental leave.
Yeah.
Klarna, being a Swedish company, have quite a positive outlook with regards to parental leave for males. They have a non-gender bias, so as a man, you can have 20 weeks full pay.
That's amazing, to be fair.
Yeah. And he kind of took that in the middle of Mia being around 6 months. So he got some time to spend with her when she was actually like eating and being a bit more like, not just wanting mum.
Yeah. I'm at that stage. My daughter's 3 months and I get no looking. She cares nothing for me.
Yeah, especially if you're breastfeeding, I think it's just all about the mum at the start. So it's quite nice that you could take it a little bit later. But what was interesting is more so kind of coming back, obviously, at a time that's so scary right now for anyone really, but especially people in talent.
100%, yeah.
When I first got back, my team were kind of like, one of the things that we got told is we're not making necessarily active hires for 2023.
When you hear that as a recruiter, alarm bells go off, right? So what the fuck am I going to do?
So that was kind of scary, and also just in general, there's a lot of people out there in similar boats. So, and I think when you're younger, before you have a baby, the job market can be a scary place. But God, add a baby to an equation, and there's just a lot more kind of fear around it.
My wife was made redundant 3 months before giving birth. And pure panic sets in. You know, who the hell is going to employ a pretty heavily pregnant woman?
Yes.
Luckily enough, she was she had a payout, and that sort of got us through. But it's having being pregnant, having a baby, and employment is just a whole scary world, isn't it? What were some of the stats that you talked about with regards to, firstly, women coming back to work, but some of the stats around women staying in work after having a baby?
Yeah. So quite some alarming stats. This is from a report from a magazine called Careers After Babies, and it was done by someone called Jessica Hay-Green. So she surveyed 848 women, and 24% of the women who go back to work full time. Sorry, only 24% of the women go back to work full time and have children.
That's a huge number, isn't it? And you know, we were talking earlier about actually our companies offering other opportunities for people, which aren't full-time opportunities, which is an interesting one.
Yeah, and then out of that, 57% of them leave within 2 years due to either redundancy or mental health issues, which is just staggering.
Yeah. If those mental health issues, I mean, redundancy is a crazy one, isn't it? Because it's almost assumed they're being made redundant because of the fact that they either are not able to perform, or they're, you know, that the assumption that they're maybe their mind's elsewhere, or, you know, whatever it might be, or there's potentially a more productive person available. I don't know. But when you talk about redundancy, is that role really being made redundant, or is it the person that maybe they're trying to get rid of? And then, mental health issues. What do you think the main causes of those mental health issues might be? I know we're speculating, but in your experience?
For me, when I was on maternity leave, I had this really glamorous idea, very naive idea, that maternity leave was going to be like brunch with mums, Prosecco in one hand, and then like baby in the pram, punching the other side. I genuinely thought...
Wishes.
Yeah, that's what it was going to be. But man, I did not expect just how lonely maternity leave was and how isolating that was. So before you even go back to work, you have this living, breathing baby that you're meant to look after that you've never done before. And it's very lonely because you do feel like you're doing it yourself a lot of the time. And as we were kind of talking earlier about, like, you've just never done this before, and you don't know kind of what the right thing is to do always.
Yes.
So when you then get thrust back into work and you're kind of expected to pick up everything, when you've been out of it for a year, your brain genuinely turns into much flinking half a baby, because you don't remember how to do certain things, and a lot of stuff just gets filtered out. So I think, I guess a lot of it can be around just the quick change, and I think it's the people in your current workplace that expect you to be able to just pick things up exactly how you left off, and that you'll be in the exact same headspace, I think.
And that's completely not the case, is it? You know, also when you're coming back, there's an anxiety, right? Because you're worrying about this is the first time you spend 6 months or 12 months just wholly dedicated to keeping this little thing alive, and then you're right going back to work. Oh shit! What are they okay? And that can cause a lot of anxiety for people, I suppose.
Speaking second-hand experience from my wife and her being off with our 2 kids, that there is a huge sense of isolation, right? You could have a really powerful and positive network around you of support, but to your point, Rose, I think she still definitely felt like she's kind of in it alone to a certain degree, and whether that was because of the dependencies or breastfeeding or anything like that, but must be really, really hard. And particularly going back is the organisation you're going back to hasn't put in plans a phased return, or you haven't been using your keep in touch days, and you go from kind of being in this bubble to then being dropped straight back into work.
Do your job.
Yeah, hiring that with obviously probably again, don't know, but I'd assume that the mum guilt of going back to work, as excited as you might be, that's a real thing, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Mum guilt is real. Like, as much as you have people telling you, no, you know, like, it's 2023, like, we shouldn't be judging. There's a lot of judgment that does happen. The amount of people that would say to me, like, "Oh, are you going back to work? Do you not worry about that?"
The tone you said it in already says a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it just exists, and you're already feeling that. And anyway, like, regardless, you know, you're already feeling that, and you know, the fear of missing out is just so real. But it's a real big challenge that for me anyway, which I didn't really foresee as much going into it.
The challenge is at that time is separating. You're not just a mum. Do you know what I mean? You have your own aspirations, career aspirations, and as well as being a good mum, and those things aren't, they don't go together. And it's, in some people's eyes, they don't go together. And so you can be a great mum and you can have an amazing career. You obviously need the right company that's going to be able to support you in going through that, I suppose.
It's being a working mum is glamorized a little bit in kind of our modern society and through social media and whatnot. Do you think that?
Yeah, I do. I think there's definitely this idea of like they can have it all. Like they can balance being like completely top of their A game and putting in those extra hours at work, motivating a team, and then coming back and being like this awesome wife if you're in a traditional setup, for your husband. Then at the same time being this like inspirational, like passionate mum who is, it's a lot of labels, I think, and it's a lot to balance. And I definitely think feels like there's an expectation that should be okay and that you should be able to handle all those different kind of titles, I guess.
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I feel like, it's social media has the pros and the cons, right? It's the angel and the devil. But at the same time, I think there's definitely look at this kind of de-influencing trend that's coming up. I feel like people are across social media now particularly looking for more relatable content and more relatable people.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely a trend that I think is going to progress, and all these kind of hyper macro influencers are seeing drops in following and drops in engagement because people want reality, right? You want to, as a mum or as a woman going back to work, you want to see the people are struggling with it at the same time, not phone in one hand, baby on the hip, sets herself bye. It doesn't work.
I think you're right. I definitely think it is changing, and I think people are really craving authenticity anyway on social media for sure. Like if I see anything like that, I just scroll past and I'm like, well, that doesn't exist. But so I think people are relating more to the vulnerability, which is good, and I think it is getting there. But for me anyway, I definitely still felt that there was this balance that I needed to achieve, which I don't know if I'm there yet, but maybe someday.
We're all a work in progress, so don't worry. I think what's really interesting is, and you mentioned this before, that potentially for the companies that are getting this right, that are providing a really good, welcome back to the working world for women after having given birth, but also maybe before they even land back, the keep in touch days, and maybe even the support for that new mum within the company. There's opportunity there, but for companies that are getting it right, there's a huge opportunity for talent for another talent pool there, isn't there? Because if these working mums can be amazing at their role, but they seem to be forgotten or maybe put to one side because of the fact that they have a child at home.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's that what you kind of talked about in terms of the keeping in touch days for me would have been, I think, astronomically different. If that would have changed, I think I would have felt much more still included, because I think there's an element that you're away and you feel a bit removed. And you were talking previous about losing your identity. I definitely felt like I lost my identity and just became this person of, I'm just a mum now and that's all I'll
just a bottle
be. Yeah. Or a towel. So yeah, I think keeping in touch days is kind of maybe overlooked as just, but it really would be, I think it would feel nice to have more of that in a busy enough to feel still part of something.
Yeah.
Which is really important.
And to know that you've got a bit of an extra, because obviously you've got your friends and your family, but then, like you say, that isn't just who you are. There, you have your work identity as well, and having that external, out of your close-knit circle, having those external contact points with friends from work and that sort of thing is another support infrastructure that new mums could potentially leverage, right?
Yeah, I didn't actually know I didn't realise I had a work identity, or I didn't realise that was part of me until I stopped working and until I left, and I kind of realised, oh, I've got nothing else to talk about. I didn't think I was like that, but I generally enjoy talking about work and enjoy kind of what I do. And as soon as it was taken away from me a little bit, I was kind of like, this is what I like. This is what I enjoy, and this is part of who I am.
100%. And I think that, so like I say, if companies can get that right, there's a whole talent pool of amazing mums there waiting for good opportunities, I think. How do you find, let's just go back a little bit. You've obviously moved from Michael Page to Klarna. What was the initial decision to go from the dark side to in-house?
Yeah, so I was actually at Michael Page. I was recruiting recruiters. So that was quite interesting. And then I obviously am now recruiting analytics, which is quite different. But for me, I felt like there's massive pros to being within an agency, which I definitely think there's way more of a team spirit within an agency. There's more kind of positivity when you're making a hire, or there's a bit more excitement around it. When I make a placement now, it doesn't exist. It was very much, okay, this is your job. So yeah, that's really different. But for me, I felt like the reason moving to Klarna is I just wanted to see the other side of it. I wanted to be very much embedded within a company and feel like I could maybe have more influence around policies and maybe work to kind of bettering the company in that sense. So for me, I wanted to be more embedded with the company at the time, it felt.
I know a lot of women in agency where I don't think, there are fantastic maternity policies within the recruitment agency world as a whole. I know there are some fantastic companies that are doing it really well, but as a whole, not sure that's potentially the case. Do you think that would have affected your decision to have a child at, or maybe even your return back to work if you were still agency side?
Funnily enough, I think at Michael Page, I don't think it would have
made a difference.
I had a really supportive team at Michael Page and a fantastic manager. So I feel like I would have been very much supported. But I do feel like with Klarna having that Swedish influence, I do feel like there's more scope around.
The Scandinavians do it well.
They do.
Okay.
And there's just the in terms of their expectations are slightly different than an agency would be in terms of actually being present in the office as well. So I think I don't think it would have determined either way, but I think
so you get a bit more flexibility on the remote working.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Definitely. It's more just not just like a new benefit. It's just this is what we do.
Yeah, it's the way of life.
Yeah.
It's not a COVID benefit.
No.
Always, and again, speaking from my wife and her return to work after our 2 kids, it was there was never any, and maybe she was just unlucky, but there was never any real kind of onboarding again. So if you think, as businesses, we always prioritise new hires, right? Their candidate experience needs to be phenomenal. They need to be onboarded properly. You need to go through this really strict onboarding plan and make sure everything's ticked off. Whereas, like, a return to work for a working parent that's been off for potentially anything up to a year, arguably that onboarding needs to be just as good. Actually, it needs to be better because this person has already given you years of service or not of service, and they've kind of been loyal to your brand. They want to come back, but you're almost, the case was almost seen like as a bit of an annoyance or a hindrance, whereas new people being onboarded were like celebrated and welcomed, which is just a bit of a weird dichotomy, isn't it? How like when you go off, you're kind of almost out of sight, out of mind.
Absolutely, and it really is needed because you're so nervous coming back. You actually get quite insecure, I think, as a new mum because I don't know, because you're so removed from it. You feel like you maybe not talented anymore in that regard, and
imposter syndrome.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
but also, like you said, you spent a year going goo gaga, and you've not been like, your brain's not been firing on all cylinders for that part of your life, and then you're expected just to switch all of the other stuff off, but then switch that back on, and you're good to go when it doesn't work like that.
And you still have this part of your brain that's thinking about your baby and if your baby's okay. And it's quite consuming as well. So yeah, it's a really weird, nervous time coming back. So I think an onboarding would be massively beneficial.
It's like a reboarding, isn't it?
Yeah,
Reboarding.
yeah.
How you've just coined it, a reboarding. A return. Yeah, I love it. But also, how much, particularly with these tech scale-ups and startups, how much changes in a year? Like, they could be using an entire different ATS. They could be using, the whole team could be changed. The hiring managers could be changed. The processes that you've worked to could be completely different. And then you're expected to just go and do your normal job. And actually, it's not the job that I left anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And Klarna's exemplary, like that is Klarna to a T in terms of changes. They talk a lot. If you've been at Klarna for 2 years, it's basically 10 years in another company. And that's one of the things why it's so amazing, because it's always changing and it's always challenging, and it keeps people really kind of invested in the company. But at the same time, like being away for a year, as I was, well, just under a year, the changes that the company had seen, particularly this year, was crazy. And I came back to a different team, a different manager. So that's all very different. And I think in terms of the stats, it says women that come back into different roles after maternity leave, 79% of those women leave within 2 years.
Because they're going into a different role.
Yeah.
It's not the role that they left, nor the role that they wanted, you know, but it's what they've ended up with.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising that they're gonna go pursue other opportunities elsewhere, because that's not the role that they joined the business for, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it certainly doesn't feel like, out of those 850 women surveyed, that the businesses have got the best end of it. You know, they've got some amazing talent that they've just mismanaged, and now they've not got anyone.
Yeah, it almost feels like we're kind of forgotten about in some ways, I guess. It's just such a shame, because it's a huge part of their work, Bill.
We talked a lot about Ben and I have talked a lot about, you know, how we can potentially better utilize that talent pool at the Rec Hub, because I think there's a whole host of recruiters that are working mums that need more flexibility, more a more understanding employer, and given those things, could be fantastic and amazing assets to any organisation. So I think it's a completely underutilized talent pool that businesses can quite relatively simply get access to by thinking like a working mum.
Yeah.
And just having a bit of empathy for that. Part of the women in recruitment piece, we wanted to talk a lot about female leadership, female managers. We definitely don't have enough in the Rec Hub, and that's something we're actively looking to improve on. This isn't a hiring pitch, time. Or is it? I mean, she thought I was going to CV sell her for a minute, but what's your experience of female leaders, and how do you what do you look for in a good female leader? Do you have any female leaders that have inspired you, and that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's probably important to say that my mum, I have my mum, and then I have 3 sisters, and my dad unfortunately passed away when I was much younger, so my mum pretty much single-handedly raised us. So I've always been very amazed by kind of female leadership in general, and I think it stems from seeing my mum raise us. And so there's 4 daughters. My oldest sister is a doctor, and my other sister's an amazing business entrepreneur, and my other sister's an English teacher. So I just think my mum's done a pretty spectacular job single-handedly. So I'm always seeking that anyway. And I've always been empowered by women. And I've had different female managers throughout my career. And I've had senior stakeholders that have been women, particularly Michael Page, that have been quite impressive and very talented at what they do. But I think something that I feel like I noticed is, I feel like when women hit a certain point in their career, I feel like they have to not necessarily disregard, but lose some of those traditional female traits in order to make them a more successful manager, and maybe take on more masculine traits. So maybe taking on kind of more, I guess, direct, kind of bullish, kind of
aggressiveness.
Yeah. To feel like they succeed, especially in the recruitment agency world. Whereas for me, I think really talented managers
irrespective of sex, they could be male or female.
Yeah. Are people that are really empathetic and have emotional intelligence, are really kind of synced in with their colleagues. And my manager at Michael Page, Christopher Bradbury, was incredibly talented at that. And he was a man, but he took, I guess, more traditional
Feminine traits
of being, allowing his vulnerability to show as well, and being inspirational, but in a very different, non-aggressive way.
Yeah.
And for me, that I would be completely loyal to him, again and again, because I just thought his managerial style was really interesting.
Maybe that's where, like you say, when some women hit a particular point in their career and they want to go to the next level, whether it's an assumption or are some of these businesses creating barriers to those women getting to the next level without demonstrating some more masculine traits, or typically masculine traits, whereas men can be more vulnerable because they are men, and therefore they don't have to. I don't know. It's a very different one, isn't it? But I read the stat the other day, and this could just be anything because I've got no backup or source. So I could just say whatever I want. However, I'm pretty certain it said 79%. That there was a survey of employees that were more likely to. 79% of them were more likely to follow a vulnerable leader, male or female. And showing vulnerability is that empowering to people that are working for you. Whereas typically, I don't know, from my career, showing vulnerability is considered a weakness, whereas that's just something that I'm learning at the moment as a leader within the recruitment world, is actually being vulnerable. Not only it feels better, like you don't have to just hold all of this shit up inside and worry about it, but actually you can talk about it, and that resonates with such a wider audience, because they realize, or people feel connected to you more because they've experienced the same things. So I completely understand where you're coming from there.
I think you're right, and I'm thinking back as my managers, and I've done a few LinkedIn posts about this, and I think the best, regardless of kind of sex, the best managers I've had have just demonstrated everything that we've just been talking about. A lot of empathy, much more caring, very open, quite vulnerable actually.
I think those things build trust.
Yeah, I mean, it transpires that the vast majority of my managers and leaders that have displayed that, and I've worked really well with, have been women. But thinking back, I don't think we should be defined by that. I think that vulnerability thread is something we talk about at the Rec Hub all the time, isn't it? Like, we should be more vulnerable and be more open because that does build connection. But it's just one of these weird kind of societal dichotomies that...
Dichotomy, big word. So many big words. How did big word in this podcast? Sorry, I'm just an idiot.
When you get to a certain point, I think men, and again, this is assumptions, and bear in mind we're two people here, or two guys here talking about women in the workplace, which feels a little bit insincere anyway, but from our assumptions of my gender set, from our experiences, like it's when men get to a certain point and they express vulnerability, I think that's celebrated. But when women get to a certain point and maybe they have to adopt these male traits, because them being vulnerable is then discouraged. So it's weird.
Yeah, if women are seen to kind of get vulnerable or emotional, they're seen as maybe their emotional regulation isn't very strong. They need, like, I've actually had that feedback before because I was
control themselves.
Yeah, it's kind of, I think people get more like panicked or something, that they're gonna like go off on and it stems from going back to like years and years of women in history having like hysteria and needing Valium. Like it stems from that kind of history that we have. So it's a working process, but I think you're right. I think maybe women take on these masculine traits because maybe it's not a safe space for them to demonstrate more feminine traits.
And also the traits that we've talked about are being more openly discussed and talked about, being positive, irrespective of sex also.
Yeah.
Being open, honest, transparent, vulnerable, empathetic, all good things. The next point that we were going to talk about which affects not only women in recruitment and talent, but just sort of parents as a whole. Is you sort of talked about networking at night. And it's topical because the Rec Hub have recently made some changes internally to sort of have a look at this and impact this based on feedback that we were getting from our employees, and that was the changes we made were to focus on doing daytime get-togethers and activities and team meetings, but then also to focus on doing them. Particularly, we're a remote-first business, so we bring everyone together once a quarter. And that often means that they have to stay overall. And so we do that on a Thursday so that it doesn't impact their weekend or time with family, albeit that is asking them to stay on a Thursday night. But we give them the choice and the option. They can go and come or they can stay. It's entirely up to them. So what's been your experience of sort of, I suppose it's more about engagement, culture and sort of, networking with your team.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think particularly in recruitment, a lot of recruiters, especially who are part of an agency, they're incentivized by big parties or bread letter days or, we've hit budgets, let's all have a big night out. And I love a big night out. Don't get me wrong.
Well, 5 months and 5 days sober, and it's killing me.
So, as a kind of 20-year-old in my early career at London, I was loving going out all the time. Then I obviously get pregnant, and then when I realized that kind of everyone was having the after work drinks, on a Friday night, on a Thursday night, I was obviously like, gosh, I really can't be part of this at all. Nor do I want to be part of this, being 8 months pregnant, walking around London with anyone. But it really kind of dawned on me then, and especially now, obviously having to do the nursery pickup, I'll never really, unless it's very much planned, be able to do those kind of nights out, be able to do that socialization. And you do really socialize with teams on those nights out. They can be quite productive, not just to get drunk, but they actually can be quite, conducive in some ways.
They allow you to particularly bond with potentially people that are going to be responsible for your next career moves.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because sometimes you're having, because the barriers are down a little bit, you can having more like interesting conversations with stakeholders or like your next manager, as you said. And I did just kind of realize that you are excluded from this if you're obviously not participating in these events. And this just isn't for parents. If you're religious and you don't drink, that's something to kind of be aware of. Or if you're just not wanting to drink for your own personal reasons, it does exclude people. I think the fact that your company are conscious of that and looking at doing daytime things is really impactful, and I think it will make a difference for people. Yeah,
for sure. And I think we are, like you say, I think the world is changing, and these topics are becoming a lot more, prominent in a lot of companies. It's funny, I was talking to a VP of people for one of our clients in Berlin, and she'd done a survey to say, how can we become more inclusive as an organization? How can we make it, better, more attractive for you to come into the office? This is coming out of COVID and trying to re-engage people back into the office. And she put out a survey expecting, like let's have a games room, let's have cereal bar, or, all of these things. And it was completely the opposite. It was have allow kids into the office.
Right.
It was, we don't have a prayer room, so I don't like coming to the office because I have to leave often to go for prayer.
Yeah.
It was baby changing units. It was things like this that encourage people back into the workspace. And it was nothing was about games. Nothing was about the fun and thrills of work. It was about actually being an inclusive organisation, which is really surprised me actually.
Sometimes I think a lot of agencies maybe look into that age range of like 20 to 30, like 20, late 20s as like, this is what everyone wants.
Yeah.
And it's really nice. It's up to a certain point, I think.
Yeah.
Because people's life changes.
100%. Like you, I think I started at 2021 in recruitment. I'm 24 now. It's a bad joke. It's a dad joke. I'm allowed that now. And I could not work. I was thinking about this the other day. I don't think I could be a recruiter or start in a world of recruitment in my 20s now, in my like 2021, remote. That would be impossible. Because that was, do you know what? That's how I fell into love with recruitment, was those wild nights out and all of those incentives and the structure, because there's a lot to learn in recruitment, and the structure and discipline that I enjoyed. Now having, if I was to onboard as a trainee or rookie recruiter remotely, I don't think I'd do anything. It'd be difficult, really difficult, from home in your bedroom.
Especially because you need to be, what I learned the most is being surrounded by directors or senior people in the office that would have these conversations with candidates. And you're kind of a sponge, and you're just taking bits and snippets of what everyone's saying that sounds like or holds weight, or, that say stuff that has gravitas. And I think that's how you learn your own little pitch.
Not only on a skills-based recruitment level, but on a social cues level, like, don't act like that. That's fucking stupid in the workplace to be doing that type of thing. Because, particularly rookie recruiters start 18 to 20, 21. They're just coming out of university where sort of social cues are pretty skewed. You're pretty drunk for most of your university time. So then you're going into the workplace for the first time, and it's, some recruitment agencies, it can be considered like an extension of university.
Grad programs or whatever, then it kind of is your natural progression, right? And those talking about social cues, those public dressing downs in the office, which might be frowned upon, but if you've got your boss having a go at your desk, and experience a number of them, I'm sure you have. That again, it's a learning experience for yourself and other people, right? Being kind of instructed to do something rather robustly in front of a room full of people, I think that does have a positive or negative. That does have a greater impact than over Slack or over a Zoom call or whatever.
Although I love Slack, we couldn't work without Slack. I was talking in a previous podcast and with a number of people in the office the other day, where someone was struggling to get hold of somebody. They never get back to me. They never, it takes forever to get hold of them. Did you bring them? No, I've messaged them multiple times. How about trying to phone them? That might help. I didn't think of that. Start there.
Yeah, that was something I really introduced at Klarna. There was a lot of emails going out to candidates and stuff like that, and it was so everyone's so afraid to pick up the phone and just speak to people. Even candidates themselves, like, they didn't expect a phone call, which is crazy to me a lot of the time. But man, do they appreciate it, and do they trust you more, and do they tell you a little bit more about how they actually feel about, rather than they would in an email?
Email, Slack, you don't understand someone's tonality or how they're saying it. You can't appreciate the empathy in someone's tone, or the urgency in, I need this CV right now, or these other candidates are going to get in ahead of you, or whatever it might be. There is, you can create so much. You can add so much depth to what you're saying, speaking it, as opposed to just writing it on an email.
So, Rose, as we've done with a lot of our other guests, we ask everybody, we'll ask you to do this after the podcast, to write a question for future guests on the pod. So we've got a couple that other guests have wrote, and then at the end we ask you to randomly pick a card, and there will be a random question on there. Not too random, still related. And then it'll be interesting to get your answer. So we'll get you to pick a card, if you will.
What will be
So
the question is, what will be the biggest change in talent, in brackets recruitment, over the next 2 years?
Big question. To be honest, you could, What's your thoughts, though, Rose?
Well, I mean, my first thought is, yes, I do not know. Is truthfully, I don't know where recruitment will be, and I think there's a lot of new tech in place, and there's a lot of talk around tech, making shortcuts. Something that I find awful is when you can have ATS systems that sometimes internal companies use, and ATS systems will automatically look through a CV, and they look at the CV and the job description, and if there's like a certain percentage that there's a match, your CV will automatically get put through the yes pile, and if it's under a match, it will automatically get put through the no pile. What's so dangerous relying on something like this is, and I've done it, there's certain tests where you can do it, is if you say something like motivated rather than hardworking, you might not be a match. So it comes down to, grammar and also people's language, which I think is really foolish to expect a robot to do that. So there's been a lot of talk around tech like that, but I always will feel strongly that people are people, and this is such a personal thing, someone's job search. And I don't believe that tech will ever get to that point, because I think there are ATS systems that are trying that, and I just don't think it works. And I think you're losing out on really good talent.
If anything, with companies that are all, as a whole, we're trying to push to be more, inclusive, diverse, and less bias. I think we do a lot of work with people around unconscious biases and that, and actually that tech is supposed to improve those metrics, but in reality, potentially could be making them worse, because I'm not using a particular language. I'm completely removed from a process.
With now the remote world of kind of almost a global talent pool, people might be applying in English, which is their second, even their third language. So there's someone that might be perfect for that role because their application doesn't sit well with the AI, the bot that sits in the ATS.
Yeah.
This doesn't seem.
On a more positive note, I think for me, the next 2 years, I think we're going to see a continued development of talent at the table. What I mean by that is I think over the last sort of 5 years or so, we've really seen people within talent get a real seat at the table, with strategy, business strategy, decision making. It's not just the bigwigs sit around, decide we need 20 hires and then go throw that request at a recruiter. You have people sitting at that table discussing strategy. How is 20 the right number? How are we going to achieve that? And actually having real genuine conversation at a much higher level, which I think we're going to see continued progression in more businesses around that.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that is actually why for me I felt like maybe this role at Klarna was quite interesting, but it's we know the market. We know what our competitors or what the company's competitors are offering. We know how realistic they're being. So absolutely being part of strategy is definitely something I would agree with.
Yeah, and I think secondly to that, Ben's a director of growth and heads up our branding, and I think what we're going to see is a much bigger rise in employer branding and how businesses not only market their products for selling, but how they market their businesses for hiring, because I think that's firstly it helps us when we're out there selling. If you're selling Klarna and they've got a terrible brand, it makes your life, an employer brand, it makes your life a bit more difficult, and also helps create a more organic pipeline. So you can spend less on recruitment costs because you've got a better brand, people want to work for you, so on and so forth. So I think we're going to see a much bigger rise of employer branding over the next 2 years, and a much heavier influence of that on how we operate as talent acquisition professionals.
Yeah,
I think so. I think we're going to see and again, this is a complete kind of finger in the air, but I think we're going to see more of a convergence of our traditional EVP channels and our consumer-facing channels. So I think there's always been a battle, right, between the people team that want access to LinkedIn and want Instagram to put the people messages out, and also the sales and marketing team want that to generate leads and to generate business because it's a consumer channel. But I think the way that businesses market to the consumer and market to potential hires, I think that's going to start kind of converging into one. And I think as the market and consumers are more aware of companies employer brands and how they treat their people. At the moment, with all these big layoffs and stuff, that's more prevalent than ever, because think back a little while ago, how often were companies in the news for how they're treating their people? It was specific, but now there's more of a public awareness about that, or consumer awareness. I think we are going to see a kind of a melding of how we talk to consumers and how we talk to hires and customers all come into one. I don't know.
Well, look, I think that's a wrap from us. Thank you very much for joining us, Rose. It's been an absolute pleasure. And ciao for now.
It's very different. So when you are working in a company which is selling used cars online, and then you move to the sex toy industry, there's a massive difference. You can
Not just because they're not secondhand.
no, definitely not. We are talking about the kind. I mean, the positions can be called the same, and it's a kind of same role, and we're looking for probably the same people for the same positions. But there can be reluctancies to join the company.